Hi, I'm Michelle Shingler, the editor-in-chief of Foreword Reviews, and you're tuning into Petit Foreword, our bite-sized interviews with indie authors. Today we're speaking with Martha Park, whose essay collection, World Without End, released on May 6th. It's a gorgeous exercise in open theology that ponders climate change, social inequities, family, and religion. Martha, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
The influence of your father's theology runs all throughout the book, including in the notion that the Bible is not a book of answers, but a book that can lead us to the best questions. What do those best questions sound like?
I think in my book, I'm comparing the tradition I grew up in, which is like a mainline progressive Protestant tradition, with the kind of overarching conservative evangelical image of Christianity that's kind of risen to the surface. And so I think between those two traditions, the questions I'm drawn to are how can these stories draw us more closely to life in this world rather than imagining another world to come? And how can these stories continue posing new questions rather than being limited to fewer meanings? How can they open up to more meanings? And so I think that's something I'm thinking a lot with, like the insistence on like biblical literalism or like scriptural inerrancy, is this idea that a story has a single meaning and that those meanings are often pointing toward a life beyond this world. And so my questions are usually, how can we come to like a expansion of meaning, and how can these stories draw us to consider our life on this world?
So you visit the ARC experience and you write an essay about that. You say you witnessed a rapid fire rewriting of natural history there. It was a really revealing essay. What, if anything, do you think anti-museums like the ARC experience stand to teach their visitors?
Well, the Ark Encounter is owned by the same people who own the Creation Museum, Answers in Genesis. And I think what's interesting is that people who aren't part of young earth creationism or this kind of brand of conservative Christianity might think of them as an anti museum, but those Christian cultures have such a deeply formed and ingrained parallel subculture, is the phrase that's often used, that these are museums to people within that culture. And so I think it really, first of all, lays bare what kind of world or perspective you're coming from. And also, I think that what I felt in that space was that it was kind of a tool for reinforcing that parallel subculture and for like confirmation that you're in the in group or the right group to be in this space. And I think kind of the caution I would give to people outside of those cultures is to not dismiss them as like fringy or smaller than they are. I think they're growing, and I think that offering a single interpretation of scripture, or the sense that someone has the right answers, or that there's this black and white binary of what you believe to is right and this way of believing is wrong, I think that's very seductive. And I think once you're in that space, it's also really easy to be manipulated. And like, I don't feel, I had someone the other day ask me like how I can visit a space like the Ark Encounter and not come away cynical. And I am very cynical about like the organization that owns it and the people that lead a group like Answers in Genesis, because I think that it's really easy to prey on people once you're offering the solution or the right answer to everything. And I think that kind of certainty is what makes me nervous about those spaces. And so if you come in as an interested, open viewer to the Ark Encounter, you're going to learn that the Earth is like 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and it was made in 6 days, and that dinosaurs, were around at the same time as people, that fossils, the layers of substrata that they're dispersed in don't have anything to do with millions of years passing. It has to do with where they were left after the flood receded. So those are kind of the offerings of that kind of parallel subculture, and they're so at odds with those of us that are outside it. But what I would say is like that world is just as real and convincing to people in it as it is kind of baffling to those that are outside it. And so not to discount it.
For sure. But I really respected you going through that whole process. And the image of leaving and being on the outside and having the doors closed behind you was really powerful. Just
Thank
that's a
you.
fabulous, yeah. Um, So, also illuminating where your essay is about the endangered Toria and about a bird that may or may not be extinct. What do you think drives those who want to believe that the ivory bill is still out there, and how do their dreams relate to the dreams of those who are still trying to save the Toria?
So with the Florida terrea, that's a extremely rare tree that is growing in North Florida. That the tree is still trying to continue its existence. It's still shooting up little baby trees. It can't produce sexually, but it is shooting up trees from like the base of older trees. And so people in North Florida that are concerned about the terrea do think that whether it's by figuring out the pathogen, the fungus that's attacking the tree, or by manually evacuating the tree farther north, that the tree could persist. Um, with the ivory bill, there's a lot more. There's kind of a binary that gets cast over all the people that are involved in the ivory bill, and people are seen as either believers or skeptics. You're kind of on one side or the other, and I think that's because there's been so little conclusive evidence about the ivory bill's continued existence. And also because there hasn't been like a last specimen like there was with the passenger pigeon or some other species where it's like we all knew this was the last one and people saw it die in a zoo. And so I think what's held in common by both groups is that people just share a love for these species and often a love for these places. A lot of times, the ivory bill, is held up as this kind of keystone species that if wetlands can be enlarged, expanded, protected, that could provide habitat for the ivory bill. And I think that there is a feeling that to let go of hope for the ivory bill to come back would also be to kind of let go of a hope for the wider ecosystems, for the other species, other places that are experiencing these kinds of losses. And I think both stories just have a real feeling of the kind of diminishment of the natural world that people are experiencing around them and the emotional effect that has on all of us.
For sure. You also have a very vulnerable essay in the collection about your traumatic experience giving birth, which hits differently in a time when reproduction is being very politicized. What do you think is missing most from conversations about reproduction, and what might change if people were encouraged to speak as honestly about giving birth as you have?
I think my story, it felt important for me to include in part because it was, in some ways, the real culmination for the essays that I was looking for a version of faith I could live with and looking all around me. And that in the end, I think what I found that a version, and it's, something I'm still living through and discovering, but it's something that came to me through my like embodied experience in the world as a human and as a woman. And so I think I spent a lot of time in the book thinking a lot, and it felt important to me that the last essay in the book was really at home in my body and my own experience. And I think what another reason it felt important to me to tell is that I'm, have the best health insurance I could imagine having, and a lot of resources and privileges, and gave birth in a bad point in 2020, but otherwise had a lot of privilege and luck on my side, and had just a horrific birth experience. And I think it's important um, for us to share how badly things can go wrong in the medical system for women who are giving birth or people who are giving birth, and that I feel like there's a sense sometimes that it's like when there's a conversation even about being pro-choice, those kinds of binaries also limit the sense of the precarity, I think, of pregnancy and birth and all the ways it can go wrong. And I think I just wanted to really tell that story to kind of add my voice to a chorus of people that's saying it's more complicated than these conversations can make it to be sound to be. I can't imagine that my single essay changes anything, but I think if people were able to tell their stories about pregnancy and birth, and how difficult it is, um, I don't know. I mean, there's a version of the answer to this question that is like maybe that conversation could be more complex and complicated a bit more by people's experience. I don't think people should have to tell their stories of medical trauma in order to change the way that bodies are being legislated and people's choices are being diminished and demonized. And I think that there's been plenty of people telling these stories for a long time, and that it's not for a lack of knowledge on anyone's part that these legislative decisions are being made. So at the end of the day, I don't think I have a very hopeful answer about that, because I think that plenty of people have been telling these stories before me, but I still think it's important if you. I felt comfortable sharing this story, and so that feels to me like a responsibility that I do that, since I feel okay with it.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Thank you. So looking toward the future, how are you going to share the stories in your book with your son, and what do you hope he takes away from them?
He's very excited about my book. He's always asking if I can read it to him, which I'm not quite ready for. But he's 4.5, and in that last essay about his birth, what was so powerful to me was that I was really trying to find a narrative for a story that had gone wrong, and I couldn't find an end for it. And part of that was because of some medical trauma, and part of it was because of the person who wants to write stories that cohere and go somewhere. I couldn't redeem that story and make it a kind of story I could live with. And I think that's, in a lot of ways, the larger project of the book is returning to old stories and thinking, how can I live in this story? What meaning does it still hold for me? And what my therapist asked, instead of going over the details over and over again, knowing you're going to have gaps in your memory, knowing you can't reconstruct this narrative, how does the story change when you imagine telling it to your son? And then it was like, that kind of snapped me out of the spiral I was in. And so I think, considering what I'll tell him, he's asked me things like, what did the doctor look like the day I was born? What do you remember about the day I was born? And for me, even in those moments, it's like the difficulty of that birth. It's not that it goes away, but it's that that's not the story I have to put on him. And I think a lot of this book was a journey of me thinking of myself as the daughter of a minister and then the daughter of someone inheriting a faith. And that as I go through the course of the book, I think of myself more as someone who's now creating and living in a version of faith for my child. And the story mimics the same kind of passage for me, where I have a version of the story that is very important to me, but the weight of that and the complexity of that is not something I necessarily need to pass on to him. And so for him, when I'm talking about all of the essays and kind of his birth experience, I can feel myself kind of crafting that difference, that there's a version that's for me and there's a version for him. And when he's old enough and wants to read the book, I think that he'll get that feeling as well. And then I take that role really seriously as someone who is very conscious of inheriting a version of faith that was not coercive, and stories that really allowed me into them again without being spiritually harmful in any way. I want to like keep and give stories to him in that same way.
Thank you so much. To our audience, the book is out now. It came out on the 6th. It's illuminating. It's such a joy to read. Martha, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much, Michelle.